Welcome back, Mbali.
Thank you.
We've just had lunch. We've also been visiting the exhibition.
Networking lounge.
The networking lounge. Did you work out the tech of how to work through the fluid space?
Jeremy, I'm very tech savvy.
Okay, sorry about that.
Don't.
So Mbali, you've been on the other side.
Yes, I have.
Tell me what's been going on while we've been sitting here on the stage.
The interactions have actually been great on the chats. Raymond especially is using the Q&A. I want to encourage everyone to make use of the question and answer feature on the platform and really just engage with us. We want to hear more from you. We have our leaderboard. Don't forget about our leaderboard.
Who's number one?
Raymond.
Raymond.
Raymond is number one,
Okay.
followed closely by Liam.
Okay.
And I think lastly we have Melanie. So that's our top three.
Is Liam technically eligible?
No.
Okay, but don't stop, Liam. Don't stop. Okay, so we've got Raymond. It's a contest between Raymond and
Melanie.
Okay, and who's after that?
Who's after that? Let's see. We have Neil Davis.
Okay.
Yes. And in fifth place, we have Ntombizandile.
Okay, so I think Raymond is from which province? Do you remember? I have a feeling it's somewhere around Gauteng or Northwest.
One of the two.
So that's province number one. Melanie, I think, is from Northern Cape, if I remember correctly.
So is Ntombizandile. She's also from the Northern Cape.
Aha, shine, Northern Cape, shine. Let's see how the leaderboard changes as we go through the course of the afternoon. Anything you want to say from our other audience? Are they live?
They are live. I just want to hear more and see more from people. Raymond is saying he's from Gauteng Health.
Okay, of course. Okay.
Yes.
So just for the audience, we were hearing in the panel about price makers versus price takers. So audience, we would like you to be information makers, not information takers.
Yes.
So please don't subject yourself to endless presentations without engaging. We'd like to see the Q&A.
We'd like interaction.
A little bit more.
Yes.
Contest what Raymond says, if he's the only one on the Q&A at the moment. Okay. Good. Anything else, Mbali?
Yes. I actually do want to encourage people to go through our Knowledge Hub, Pepper Knowledge Hub, where you'll see a lot of our resources on spending reviews. There's also the GTAC LinkedIn page. Please do visit that, subscribe and like it. And also just share this conference platform with your colleagues, share the link, and let's just engage more and interact more. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Mbali. So we are going to explore remuneration analysis and modeling. And this is the time that we're going to look at the impact of personnel analysis on policy making or on public policy.
Yes.
I think this is always interesting. I mean, this issue is very live. I'm sure most of you these figures. And we've got Antony Altbeker, who is going to be giving us a presentation for our afternoon slot. Antony is quite extraordinary. I know he'll be very upset with me kind of singing his praises, but Antony is really the go-to guy for so many things. He's a key member of the Pepper team and provides great insights and analysis on a number of areas, particularly personnel analysis. And he's an economist, and he's been around for a while. He's been in government since 1994, or associated with government, and he worked in the Ministry of Safety and Security in 94, and has worked in Treasury in a number of policy think tanks. He's also worked for the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, the Institute of Security Studies, the Center for Development Enterprises, and he also teaches. And you'll see in his bio that he teaches undergrad, postgrad, and diplomas. So
And public officials.
And a lot of public officials. What's not in his bio is that he's a father of 3 wonderful children, although they are teenagers. So I don't know if that's always the case, Antony. So Antony, a very warm welcome to you, and we look forward to hearing a little bit more about the impact of personnel analysis on public policy. Over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Always nice to be reminded about how old I am. I am struggling to find where my...
Seems like we're not...
Well,
can you hear me?
Got the...
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I can hear you. Okay, good. But for some reason, when I look for what I want to share with you, I can't see it, even though my computer tells me it's open. So I don't understand that. Just give me half a second to figure out what's going on here. There we go. Can you see my slides? Can you see my slides? Someone? Anyone? Can you hear me? Hello? Okay, I'm going to assume you can hear me, even though I'm not getting all that much feedback. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about some work we did. Actually, it culminated last year, and it was initiated by a request from the Western Cape provincial government, who asked GTAC to help them think through a strategy for managing compensation spending over the medium and long term, because as with all the provincial government's compensation spending makes up a very large proportion of their total spending, and it creates all kinds of pressures on the rest of their budget, and they wanted to know what could be done about it. They wanted to understand it better, and they'd given us a list of potential strategies for containing compensation spending growth. So, and they wanted us to kind of provide them with some estimates of the kinds of savings that could be made if, for example, you enforced retirement at 65, if you encouraged early retirement, if you try to contain overtime, and various other kinds of strategies to help reduce the pressure that the compensation budget was putting on the rest of the budget. Having done that for the Western Cape, IGR asked us if we would replicate and reuse the methodology to then look at all 9 provinces, and so we updated that all last year to look at the trends and the composition of spending on compensation in the provinces, how that's changed over time, and to look at some of the savings. I'm going to focus in this presentation mostly on the trends and the composition of spending and what's driven that. With only a little bit, I've only put a bit of time, a few slides together for the savings. That it's quite a complex business of trying to explain how it all fits together. But I'll give you a high level overview of it. Just to say that the work was done between myself, Mbali Buthelezi, and Liam. I hope they're in the audience, but if not, they, this was very much a team effort, and I think that the work reflects very much their contribution more than my contribution. But I'll do the presentation in order to get as much of the credit as possible. So let me tell you what I'm going to do. We're going to go through the data that we have on compensation spending in the 9 provinces. We're going to review the profile of provincial establishments and how that has changed over time. We're going to look at aggregate changes in headcount, and both in relation to itself over time, as well as in relation to population and to provincial GDP. We're going to look a little bit at, I've got 2 sections on education and health in particular, because they make up such a large proportion of provincial spending, and then we've got a section on everything else provinces spend compensation that incurs compensation costs for provincial governments. And we're going to look at some comparisons between the provinces and how they compare. Now, there's this project probably generated like over 1,000 slides worth of data, because we've got data for every province and every department in every province and the rest. So this is very much a high-level summary of it. The work itself relies on PERSEL, and it's important to say that because when you use PERSEL, it means that there are some areas of expenditure that are for which you are blind. PERSEL is used by only a handful of provincial public entities and by none of the national public entities, and it's also not used by local government. So this is very much work that covers only the main budget, national and provincial government. In general, when I'm talking about headcounts, we're looking at full-time equivalents. So what we do is we don't look at the number of people employed on any given date. What we do is we look at the average number of people employed over the course of the year, which means that if somebody's employed for all 12 months, they count as a full employee. If they're employed for only 6 months, they count as half an employee. But basically, that gives you a much more stable basis for looking at comparisons, because sometimes with some departments, there are substantial changes before or after the period you're looking at, and that can distort your analysis quite a lot. There was a particular problem when we've done this work in police, for example, because they have large recruitments early in the year. So depending on which date you're looking at, you might get quite different results for trends of their employment practices. The only time we don't use full-time equivalents is when we actually do calculations of savings. Then we're looking at the absolute number of officials of particular ages and in particular posts, because that's the only way to do that work effectively. So the broad findings, and some of this I think will be very familiar to people, partly because I'm sure you've heard this kind of presentation in the past, but also because this is something we have to work on all the time as in treasuries across the country. So, but the basic story is this, that compensation spending has tended to increase faster than spending as a whole in government. The figures I'm reflecting here are 2006 to 2019, and one of the reasons I do that is because in 2020 there was the non-implementation of the third year of the wage agreement, and that actually kind of changes some of the calculations, because that decision was taken as a result of these historic trends. So if you kind of include the effects of the decision in the calculations, then you kind of miss the point, because the historic trends is what drove the decision. And so to include the effect of that decision in understanding the trends, then you're missing what the trends really were. In broad terms, compensation spending went from 155 billion in 2006 to 565 billion in 2019, rising from about 31% of spending to 32% of spending. That doesn't sound like very much, but bear in mind that over that same period, there was quite a substantial increase in spending, in particular on interest payments, and on money paid to state-owned companies, and so the proportion is actually obscures the fact that compensation spending was growing more quickly than spending as a whole. And you can see that in the last column of that table, which shows that compensation spending on average from that period grew at about 10.5% a year, which was faster than spending on goods and services, slower than spending on interest payments, and faster than transfers and subsidies. So what you see over that period is that compensation spending is growing, and it increases as a proportion of GDP from about 8% of GDP to about 11% of GDP. In the recession, during the COVID recession, that increased even further. It was about 12% of GDP. So what's driven that? Essentially, compensation spending is driven by two variables: the number of people who are employed and how much they're paid. And these graphs try to disaggregate that. If you look at the top graph, you can see that overall, after adjustments for inflation, compensation spending rose by 72% from 2006 to 2019, and then fell a little bit because of the impact of the wage freeze. And that increase in total spending is made up partly by an increase in personnel numbers, which rose by about 19% over the whole period, and largely by an increase in real remuneration, which rose by about 42% over the whole period, but 45% if you exclude the wage freeze in 2020. Another way of depicting what went on is that, as I said, the compensation spending went from about 144 billion in 2006 to 2020 to 528 billion in 2020. Of that, 44% can be explained by just the effect of inflation, and the rest is made up 60-40 by an increase in real remuneration and an increase in headcounts. So for every 1% increase in headcounts, there was a 1.5% increase in real remuneration, which drove the total rise in compensation spending. For the provinces, compensation spending obviously makes up a very large proportion of provincial spending, and it has grown quite a lot faster overall than provincial budgets. So provincial budgets grew, depending if you use 2006 to 2019 or 2006 to 2020, grew by 9.8 or 9.5% a year. Compensation spending grew by 10.5 or 10% a year. So that gap between the total budget and the growth in spending on compensation means that everything else has grown less quickly than the budget as a whole, and in particular, goods and services budgets, transfer payments, capital spending have all grown considerably slower than the budgets as a whole. In fact, capital spending grew at about the rate of inflation over the period. So we weren't really investing the rate of investment in capital and infrastructure by provinces was no greater in 2020 than it was in 2006 after you adjust for inflation. What happened to headcounts? Well, overall, if you look at from 2006 to 2020, provincial establishments grew by 18%, and national departments establishments grew by 24%. So overall, there was a 19% increase in total employment in government over the period. It's really important to know and to realize that almost all of that growth happened between 2006 and 2011. So between 2006 and 2011, total the establishment grew by 17%. In the 10 years that followed, it grew by only another 2%. So essentially, we've had flat employment levels in government since 2011. There are some big variations between the provinces, and you can see that in the first period, in 2006 to 2011, there was a lot of growth in the establishments of Gauteng and the Northern Cape and the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, and there was some shrinkage in the Northwest. In the subsequent period, there was shrinkage in the Eastern Cape and in Limpopo, and basically unchanged numbers in most of the other provinces. It's really important to understand that a lot of that change is really about two things. One is the function shift of TVET colleges that moved to the Department of Higher Education in 2014. And the second is a series of boundary changes that affected provincial establishments early in the period, particularly in 2007 and 2008. You can see that in this chart, which tries to depict what happened to each province over this entire period. So what we've got here is it's basically arrivals and departures from the provinces. And if you read the chart from left to right, you can see, if we take the Eastern Cape, there were 18,116 people who left the Eastern Cape and are now employed in another province or in a national department. And this is over the entire period. So this is from 2006 to 2020. Of those 18,458 went to the Free State, 1,738 went to Gauteng, etc. You can see, and that gives you the sense of the departures. The total arrivals in the provinces, you read from top to bottom. So the Eastern Cape received 501 people from the Free State, 1,131 people from Gauteng. And at the very bottom line, you can see what the net change is. And the net change in red shows that the Eastern Cape lost in these movements of people, lost 7,714 people. Free State lost 3,583. Gauteng gained 8,378. And if you look at these two pictures, what the things that stand out are the big losses incurred by the Eastern Cape, by Limpopo, and by the Northwest, and conversely the substantial gains in Gauteng and the national departments. It's important to understand that all of that really has to do with boundary changes, or not all of it, but a very substantial fraction of that is accounted for by boundary changes and by the transfer of the function for TVET colleges. So if we look just at the 46,000 people who moved to national departments, you can see that 24,600 of them moved to Department of Higher Education and Training. So that's basically that function shift of TVET colleges. And you can also see that Gauteng received a lot of personnel from the Northwest, and that too is about the boundary changes around Pretoria. And KZN, Eastern Cape, there was the boundary changes around Matatiele. So those are the big drivers of what changes have been. And really, it's not a kind of there isn't really a story to tell of provinces gaining at the expense of some provinces gaining at the expense of other provinces. Where there is a story to tell, and what's quite interesting about the distribution of public services and in particular public officials in South Africa, is that there are quite wide variations in the number of people employed by government per capita in the provinces. So, these figures have fallen for pretty much all the provinces over time. Obviously, the effect of boundary changes and things like that have moderated this a little bit. But overall, the provincial governments typically employ, on average, between 15 and 17 people per 1,000 people in the province. But there's quite wide variations. So the Western Cape and Gauteng have employment levels that are around 12 or 13 per 100,000, whereas Free State, Limpopo, and Northern Cape have employment levels of around 20 per 100,000. So there's quite substantial differences in the number of personnel per capita in the provinces. Another way of thinking about this is to think about the relationship between the number of personnel employed in provincial government and provinces' GDPs. And yeah, I mean, it's not completely straightforward to estimate provincial GDPs, but Stats SA does provide these figures, and we're taking them on faith. And what you can see is that between 2008 and 2019, there were, on average, between 170 and 200, it started around 200 and it's fallen to around 170 officials per billion rand of provincial GDP. But again, there are quite substantial differences between the provinces. So in Gauteng, there are 93 officials per billion rand of GDP, whereas in Limpopo and the Eastern Cape, the numbers are over 300 officials per billion rand of GDP. So that's which is really a reflection of the denominator in that calculation, is how much economic activity there is in those provinces. Another way you can think about that, and one of the reasons why public sector employment is so important, particularly in the poorer provinces, is that public sector wages make up quite substantial amounts of, or are the equivalent of quite large fractions of provincial GDP. So in Eastern Cape and Limpopo, provincial government's compensation spending is about 13 or 14% of provincial GDP. That figure is much lower in Gauteng and the Western Cape, which are obviously much richer provinces, and there the compensation spending is like 4 or 5% of GDP. But you can see why this is, it's kind of got macroeconomic importance. So what happens in public sector employment, particularly in the poorer provinces. Let's start thinking about the makeup of the establishment and how that's changed over time. And effectively, what this graph does is it tries to summarize, what this slide does is it summarizes what's happened overall, as well as what happened, how the provinces differ one to the other in terms of the composition of their establishments by salary level. So if you look at the chart on the bottom left, you can see that in 2006, there were 220,000 officials in salary levels 1 to 4. That number has fell to 167,000 by 2020. So there's quite substantial decline in absolute terms in the number of people who are at the lowest salary levels. At the same time, there was a very large increase in the number of people in salary levels 9 to 12, from just under 85,000 to over 188,000 over the same period. And if you look at the chart at the top right, it gives you a sense of the proportions of what's going on here. So in 2006 and in 2011, there were nearly 30% of personnel in the provinces were in salary levels 1 to 4. That figure is under 20% by 2020, and what's risen most is the number of personnel and the proportion of personnel who are in salary levels 9 to 12. So what you have in effect is this kind of grade inflation in the public sector, which means that obviously that the typical employee is, because the typical employee is at a higher salary level, they obviously earn more than they once did. It's important that at the highest levels, salary levels 13 to 16, the numbers there are quite small. Firstly, they're only about 1% of total employment in provincial establishments, and they're also reasonably stable. They've risen from a little under 4,000 to a little over 4,000 over that period. So it's not that's driven the change in the establishment so much. It's the changes at salary levels 5 to 8, and in particular salary levels 9 to 12. I think this is my last slide before we will have two more slides before we can have a little break for questions and answers before I come back for further to talk about education and health. The nature of appointment. So we looked in the course of this work. We looked at the conditions of service of officials, because as an employer, obviously the provincial governments have somewhat different responsibilities for fixed appointment officials and contract staff. Contract staff, in principle, it's not straightforward. In principle, when contracts expire, they need not be renewed. This is not entirely true, because there are requirements on the Departments of Health, for example, to employ recent graduates and things like that. But nevertheless, there's a sense in which there's a different relationship between the employer and the employee and the employed for fixed employment, for full-time officials on fixed employment and for contract staff. So in the provinces, about 6% of officials are contracted staff, 3% are temporary staff. The rest overwhelmingly are either on fixed appointment or are on probation to become fixed appointees. But there are these like 10% of officials who are contract or temporary staff. We looked at a little bit more detail at the contract staff. 50% of them are non-OSD, and obviously 50% are on OSD, are being paid as professions on OSDs. Of those, most are medical or nursing. So there's obviously quite a lot of contracting of staff that are not fixed appointments, who are providing direct services as doctors or nurses in the provincial departments of health. Finally, we looked a little at entries and exits. So I've said already that the number of personnel has increased by about 17-18% for provincial departments over this whole period. Well, that obviously means that the number of appointments must exceed the number of people who've left government. And what you can see is that, roughly speaking, there's been 1.2 appointments for every termination. So the number of appointments is about 20% larger than the number of people who leave each year on average. Typically, in a typical year, about 6% of staff leave the public service, and about 7% of the number of officials in employment are new appointees. So that's quite a large amount of churn. Churn is important because one of the implications of churn is that, in principle at least, it's possible for departments to downsize through natural attrition. And natural attrition is, of course, the default method that a lot of firms and governments use to reduce headcount. The point is that there is quite a lot of churn, and so it is in principle possible for headcounts to fall quite quickly, although for various reasons which we can discuss in Q&A, that's not necessarily the optimal strategy for managing the establishment and for containing costs. So I am going to pause there and then have a look at questions. I'm sorry, I've been looking only at my slides and I have not been following the questions, so I'm going to need some guidance on how to proceed from Jeremy, I think.
Great. Thank you, Antony. Thanks for that tour of public employment expenditure, personnel analysis. Let's reflect on what Antony's been saying. And Antony, you do have some interesting reflections. Hello, Zandi. I realized that's Zandi, the Zandi I know from the Northern Cape. There was something you said, Antony, which it explains why she's been in her position for so long, and people seem to enjoy that. And then we've got questions from Melanie, where she's saying natural attrition can be supported by complete freezing or hiring, or by constraining the numbers of new appointments. But because decisions reside with HODs and other, in this context, they have the incentive to free ride on the savings that other departments might secure, keeping their own department staffed at the maximum. Stricter rules for National Treasury and Provincial Treasury leadership are required to clear or address this. So that's one point from Melanie Kasonk. And let's see from Neo Bohwatile is asking, I think OSD should be revisited as part of the wage bill reduction instead of primarily focusing on headcount reduction. Okay. And then Zandi's staying live in the conversation about where she's at. Antony, do you want to respond to those two to get us going? And sorry, just before you do, I think the team might put on a poll or two into the link for you to engage with at some stage during the Q&A or soon thereafter. But be on the lookout for a poll, which will also keep you alive and alert to what we're talking about. Antony, back to you.
So Melanie or Melanie, I'm not sure. I'm not going to answer your question now because I actually have something to say about this towards the end of the presentation. So if maybe we can revisit this question at the end. The question from Neo, you know, this is something that people, there is this idea. The OSD, obviously the people on OSDs earn more than non-OSD officials as a general rule. That is a consequence of what was done when the OSDs were introduced 2007, 2008, 2009, around then, when people who went on to OSDs got big jumps in their salaries. Since then, the rate of increase on OSDs and on non-OSDs has basically been identical. And there isn't, so unless one is prepared to cut OSD salaries, there's not a great deal, it's very hard to see how a focus on the OSDs is going to generate very substantial savings. There is an argument that could be made that says that people who earn more should have lower increases. And as a practical matter, that actually is what typically happens as a result of the wage negotiations. There's a slight anomaly here because some of the OSDs with the highest average wages, for doctors in particular, people are counted as being in salary levels 10 and 11 and receive salary increases commensurate with that, whereas people who are who are non-OSDs but in salary levels 13 to 16 get increases that are somewhat lower because that's how the negotiations the effect of the negotiations would typically say that CPI plus 1 or 2 for salary levels 1 to 8, CPI plus 1 for 9 to 12, and then CPI for above. That's historically how it's happened. But generally speaking, the OSDs don't have any advantage in the rate of increase of their salaries. What they do earn more than non-OSD personnel. The amount of savings one can get by slowing the rate of increase on OSD salaries is not very high, but there are, it is at least plausible that an argument could be made that people on OSD should be treated differently from people who are non-OSD. To the best of my knowledge, that's never been attempted by anyone in organized labor, and I don't think that the employer has made that argument either in negotiations. But
Thanks,
to
Antony.
make any substantial savings would require actually cutting OSD salaries, which I don't think anybody has appetite for.
Yeah. Antony, we've got another question from James Rotenbach, who asks if we've studied what the impact of COE expenditure has on the poorer provinces as officials spend their salaries in their towns and regions and therefore drive some of the economic activity. And then Lindiwe Ngongwane is saying, in instances where there are vacancies in critical posts and we advocate for managing headcounts downward, how should institutions go about capacitating existing teams? And Antony, I know you can count to 3, so I'm going to ask you just to hold, because there's one more. Hang on, there's actually 2 more. Hermi Borain is asking, how does our public service size compare to that of other countries? Do we have a bloated public service? And Raymond is back, and he asks, do you think inflation targeting is still relevant, given the contradictory monetary policy carried out even when the public servant COE have not improved in 3 years? He continues, would you advocate for nominal GDP targeting as an alternative to inflation, to the inflation targeting regime? Antony, these are nice ones for you. So I'm gonna, let me invite you to chew on those, and then after that, go straight into the remainder of your presentation, please. And, we've got very, very brutal people that run the time in the studio. So you've got 20 minutes left for everything you want to say.
No,
okay, great.
Okay,
back to you, Antony.
So James, no, we haven't studied it, but we do think that that's a real issue. And that's what the point is of that graph about the relationship between public sector compensation spending and GDP in the provinces is, because it is a large fraction of GDP in the provinces. And given that it's a high proportion of employment in poor provinces, and that it's high quality employment relative to many of the other public service, on the economic conditions in the rest of the the province. Lindiwe's question, I mean, I think this is something that everybody struggles with. We certainly are not advocates of natural attrition and post freezing as a way of containing compensation spending growth, because what tends to happen with that is that it kind of has quite adverse effects on the composition of public service, because the people you most need may also be the people who are least likely to leave. And so what you end up having is this thing where people who you need most are the hardest to keep, and the people who are less helpful are the ones who stay on. And so this thing of critical posts is difficult. I think we'll come back to it later, but it's we don't have any insight into what is a critical post and what is not a critical post. We are looking at the Purcell data, and we're not in a position to offer meaningful advice on what is critical and what is not critical. But we recognize, I think, as everybody does, that there are differences in how important some jobs are to the functioning of the public sector. But what's important can vary quite a lot by unit, right? In some places, the manager, it's not necessarily the professional staff who are the most important driver of effectiveness and efficiency, but the managers of the staff, of the unit. So it can be quite challenging to figure out what is critical and what's not critical. Having said that, I think it's fair to say that we all know of places where there's lots of employment that seems non-critical at face value. Hermes' question on the bloatedness or otherwise of the public sector. Yeah, I didn't put in the slides we've got on that, but the short answer to this is that measured in per capita terms, the South African public service is not very large. So the number of people employed by government in comparison to the population is not overly large. What is unusual about the South African public sector is that salaries are quite a lot more generous than is typical for public sectors in developing countries. And so the premium that the gap between public sector wages and typical wages in outside of government is quite large in South Africa. And there's some international evidence about this. So this is very hard to compare jobs and to compare professions and to compare across countries. But there's some evidence that public sector employees in South Africa earn larger multiples of GDP per capita than public sector workers in the rest of in other countries. So we don't have an overly large public sector, and in some respects, because we're such an unequal society, you could make the case that we should have that in theory, at least, we should have a larger public sector because of the extent to which people rely on public services or as part of their household welfare. But at the same time, our typical wages are higher than our wages are typically higher than elsewhere, and that obviously constrains what is affordable. The last question I'm completely going to duck, because we are taught very quickly at National Treasury that discussion about inflation targeting or otherwise is not something for the minister. So I'm not going to venture into that terrain at all. So I apologize for that, but it's not for me to reason why. And I'm going to go back to talking about things I do know about, which is compensation spending. Can you see my slides again? I'm going to just assume you can, because I've actually I'm now looking at them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about education, and then about health, and then about the rest of provincial government compensation spending. So education is obviously an enormously important component of compensation spending in between education and health. It's basically 90% of compensation spending in the provinces. That's really what provincial governments do from the point of view of expenditure. It's education and health, and then bits and pieces of other things. And within those two departments, but in particular within education, compensation is a very important, a very large proportion of what is spent. So compensation typically accounts for about 80% of spending inside the education budget. So obviously, what happens with compensation spending drives the size of the budget, because that's the only way that because of the weight of compensation spending within the budget as a whole. So what we see is that over the period 2006 to 2020, the total budget for compensation spending grew by 9.1% a year. Compensation spending grew by 8.8% a year. Bear in mind that's including the effect of the wage freeze in 2020. If you exclude that, if you go 1 year back, look at 2006 to 2019, compensation spending and total budget have grown at exactly the same rate over that period, 9.5% a year. We do also, though, have to factor in the effect of the transfer of the function of TVET colleges out of the provincial departments and to the national department. If you put that back in, what you will see is that aggregate spending on education rises by about 2 percentage points per year, the growth rate of aggregate spending, and the growth rate for compensation rises by about 0.5% a year. So that's a big chunk of what's going on, but the gap between those two things is really NSFAS. So if you take out NSFAS, then again, you're back to everything being driven by the growth in compensation spending in education. So just a little bit more detail on the function shift that resulted, that occurred when the TVET was shifted from provinces to national. So headcounts in the education sector grew quite quickly from 2006 to 2011, from about 400,000 to about 500,000 between 2006 and 2011. Since then, they've basically been stable. That's if you include the TVET colleges. If you look at the impact of the function shift on the provinces, you can see there's quite big differences in what happens to the provinces. So the Eastern Cape, lost about 6,000 people to the at the time of the function shift, with most of that, and that was about 8% of its personnel in the education department were shifted to national. Whereas in Northern Cape, there was almost nobody who was shifted to national as a result of the function shift. These graphs replicate the graphs I showed you earlier, but they're focused only on education. The one on the left focuses national and provincial, so it will include the TVET colleges because they're captured either as provincial or as national, depending on what year it's in. The ones on the right, you can see the kink in the curve in 2014 when the TVET colleges function shift happened, but overall, you can see that what has happened in the Department of Education is very similar to what happened overall in government. So if we look at the whole picture, including the national departments, headcounts grew by about 12% between 2006 and 2020, and real after inflation salaries grew by about 40%. Total spending after inflation grew by 56%. That's all of those are inclusive of the effect of the wage freeze. And so you can see again, education departments are a big proportion of government as a whole. So again, this pattern helps drive the overall pattern for government as a whole. But you can see that this is very similar to what the national picture looks like for government as a whole. An increase of personnel up till about 2011. Then basically stasis with no new additions to personnel numbers. but with quite considerable increases in average remuneration to personnel over that time. An important phenomenon in education in particular is that we've seen a very strong rightward shift in the age profile of teachers. The blue line in the top graph is 2006, orange is 2011, gray is 2016, and yellow is 2020. And you can see that it shifts to the right over time. And so more and more teachers are over 50 over that period. And that has important implications for long-term planning of personnel and the establishment in the education department, because what is happening in the education department is the aging of the workforce, and as the workforce ages, obviously it becomes more expensive because people accumulate these annual increments. Older teachers are more expensive than younger teachers, and the consequence of that is more expensive headcounts, and that's partly reflected in the chart I showed you earlier of the higher costs. What's interesting, I haven't got the data here, but in the wider study, it's quite visible, is that the aging of the workforce is a particularly pronounced effect in the poorer provinces, where there's been much less replacement of teachers, partly because populations have declined. There's been an urbanization trend in the country, so more and more of the population moves to Gauteng and the Western Cape. More and more of the equitable share goes to Gauteng and the Western Cape as a result. But teachers remain employed in the poorer provinces, so those teachers have become older and more expensive per person. There are going to be quite substantial savings over the next 10 years as those teachers retire and are partly replaced and partly not. And some of them will not be replaced, but some of them who are replaced will be replaced by younger teachers who will be earning less than the people they replace. Quick look at healthcare. So healthcare has seen some very substantial growth in compensation spending over the period, and that's partly because the health function has seen the fastest growth in personnel for government as a whole, and in particular nurses have been the fastest growing cohort of public servants over the period 2006 to 2020. So health spending grew from 54 billion a year to 240 billion rand a year between 2006 and 2020, with compensation spending rising at an average annual rate of nearly 12.5% up till 2019. And that meant that it grew from about 54% of total spending to over 60% in 2019. Again, it fell in 2020 because of the wage freeze. But the wage freeze didn't slow compensation spending as much in health departments as it did elsewhere, precisely because of COVID, there were appointments made in healthcare that other departments didn't see. But compensation spending grew very rapidly in healthcare over the whole period. And here you can see the blue line shows the effect. Well, the overall effect is quite dramatic in healthcare. So in real terms, compensation spending grew by 120% in healthcare between 2006 and 2020. And that's made up of an increase in personnel numbers of about 40% and an increase in real average remuneration of about 60%. That increase in real average remuneration, as I was saying earlier, is largely the result of the implementation of the OSDs in the before 2010, and then the application of inflation plus cost of living adjustments to the health function along with everybody else since then. So both the headcounts have grown faster than the average for government as a whole, and average remuneration has grown faster than was the case for the rest of government. You can see that there's been significant, as I said, there's been a 39% increase in total employment in in the health function from 2006 to 2018, to 2020. But that also includes a large increase in employment in 2020 relative to 2019. So there was 18,000 additional appointments in the health function as a result in 2020, largely as a result of it. So the community healthcare workers as well as additional nursing staff. The fastest growth was in Gauteng and in Mpumalanga, and in 2020 the fastest growth was in Gauteng and the Northwest. Surprisingly, in Limpopo there was actually a decline in employment in the health function in 2020. So as I said, there's been both rapid growth in remuneration and in headcounts in the health function. In terms of headcounts, obviously it's harder to tell before the OSDs were introduced, but you can see by 2009 when the OSDs are largely in place, there were about 112,000 nurses employed. That number's increased to 148,000 by 2020. Doctors or medical includes not just doctors but ambulance workers and some other professions like that as well. But the medical OSD has gone from just under 28,000 to 47,000 over that period. Less growth in the non-OSD component. In fact, actual shrinkage for much over the period as a whole for non-OSD employment in the health function. Average remuneration in healthcare, as I said, has grown very quickly. So it's real average remuneration, i.e., after inflation, grew by 3.5% a year from 2006 to 2020, including the decline in real average remuneration or the freezing of real average remuneration in 2020. The freezing of nominal remuneration in 2020. Most of that again happened in the early years. So if you look at the fourth column, you can see that at the bottom that average annual real growth in salaries from 2006 to 2011 was close to 5.5%. So that's after inflation in the health profession. From 2011 to 2016, the growth slowed to 2.8%. And then it slowed further from 2016 to 2018, but largely as a result of the wage freeze in 2020. So it only grew by about 0.6% a year over that period. So the remuneration growth as a whole has been a big driver of the compensation spending pressures in government as a whole, but very much so in the health department as well. Within health spending, a substantial fraction of health spending is compensation spending in healthcare is accounted for overtime. So basically, overtime in provincial government is overwhelmingly dominated by overtime in healthcare, and in particular for nurses and doctors who account for nearly 90% of all overtime spending in provincial governments as a whole. And so great is it that on average, the typical employee in the medical OSD earns about 19% of their remuneration from overtime. So overtime isn't a big deal in the rest of government, but it's quite a big deal in healthcare. The other provincial functions, so everything that's not health and not education, what does that look like over this period? So in 2020, there was nearly 160 billion rand spent on the other functions, up from 53 billion in 2006. Within this, compensation actually only accounts for about a third of spending in 2020, although it was only a quarter in 2006. But that's mostly because goods and services and capital spending is quite a lot. Makes up a bigger fraction of spending in these functions than they do in the rest of provincial government. Even so, compensation spending in these functions has grown a lot faster than the budgets as a whole. So 2006 to 2019, compensation spending was growing at 11% a year compared to total budgets of less than 9% a year. The effect of the wage freeze, again, you can see it. Compensation spending is still growing faster than the rest of the budget, but the gap is not as large. Again, you can see that this is driven partly by increased numbers, so a 21% increase in numbers of people employed in non-health, non-education functions in the provinces, combined with an increase in real remuneration of around 50% over that period. So I'm going to give you only a couple of headlines about savings, and then I'm going to stop and we can open for questions. But we were asked to review a couple of mechanisms for reducing for saving money on the compensation budget, and essentially because we were looking at provincial governments, we did not really look at the level of remuneration, because provinces have very limited power over that. Their only power really is at this level, is at setting post levels in their establishments. That gives them some power to control remuneration levels in government, but mostly they are price takers. They depend, how much people get paid in each post depends on the outcomes of national negotiations, which are run by the central government departments. So because we were giving this advice to the provincial governments, we were looking really at mechanisms to control headcounts. And we looked at 4 basic mechanisms. One is not filling posts as people leave the public service. The other is retirement of officials over the age of 60. Third was early retirement of officials between 55 and 60. And then the fourth is the non-renewal of contractors' contracts, which, as I said, isn't completely straightforward because of in some cases, there's statutory requirements for example, for Department of Health to take on certain numbers of students each year. So it turns out that what determines how much savings you can get out of any of these strategies, any of these vehicles, depends on what proportion of the eligible population is impacted. So if you're talking about the retirement of officials over the age of 60, are you talking about all of them? Are you talking about half of them? Are you talking about 20% of them? That's obviously, the more who take it up, the bigger the potential savings. But that's only part of the equation. The other part of the equation is how many people do you replace? And here we don't have a firm view that that the appropriate strategy is a 0 replacement rate, because as I was saying earlier, there are critical posts. You can't expect that to be the case, and you can't expect that in the professions, but you also can't expect that even in management positions. It's just not reasonable to think that departments run themselves and there won't be replacements of people who leave. The bottom line about all of this is that unless you make pretty extreme assumptions about, in particular, replacement rates, none of the 4 strategies generate very meaningful savings. And this is a very high-level summary of what you get. Now, it's very important to say, you can't add these things up because some people fall into both categories. So there'd be a lot of double counting. You can't say, well, how much would we save just by if we implemented all 4? So this just really gives you a feel of what each strategy on its own would save. You can't, there'd be a fallacy of composition if you try to add them all together, because then you'll get a lot of double counting, because freezing of posts as people leave includes people who are over the age of 60, or people who might qualify for early retirement. So you can't count both of them. Basically, what this table does, it tells you how, in the first 2 columns, how many people are in each of those categories. So in a typical year, 73,000 people leave provincial government. When we looked at this, I think this was the 31st of March 2021, there were 52,322 people over the age of 60. There were 126,441 between 55 and 60. And in a typical year, 71,391 contracts end. So that gives you a sense of the scale of the number of people that might be impacted. The next column tells you how much they are currently being paid, essentially. So on average, so the 73,000 people who leave, on average, if you take their average salary of people who leave, that's about 22.5 billion rand of compensation spending that's going on. So how much do you save? Well, it depends on how many people you're talking about and how many people you replace. So let's say that all 73,417 people leave, as you would expect, but you don't freeze all the posts. You only freeze 20% of the posts. In other words, you replace 80% of the people that leave. Then the savings are not the 22.4 billion that people are earning now. The savings are only 4.5 billion. But if you replace 100% of the people, then the savings fall to zero. Conversely, if this doesn't really work for the freezing of people leave, because people will leave every year. But if we look at one line down, retiring officials over the age of 60. If we said we're not going to retire everybody over the age of 60, we're not going to retire all 52,322 of them. We're only going to retire 30% of them. And then we're going to replace them with younger, cheaper staff. Then the savings are about 2.5 billion. If we're going to retire 30% of them, but replace all of them, then the saving is only 1.7 billion. So you can see that the savings depend overwhelmingly on what your assumption is about whether people will be replaced or not. So it's one thing to say we're going to adopt one of these strategies, but we all know that there are real reasons why you would want to replace people, and you can't assume that you can just freeze all posts and not replace anybody. One of the interesting variables is the early retirement variable. So you'll see those two red numbers. We assume that people won't take early retirement unless you incentivize them to do it. And in particular, what you've got to do is you've got to say that the penalty that they will incur for retiring early on their pensions, the state will make up the difference. Will provide the funding to the pension fund so that the early retiree doesn't incur that loss on their pension. Otherwise, people won't take early retirement. When you apply that logic, and you say that we're going to replace everybody who leaves, then it costs you more to engage in an early retirement program than the savings you're likely to achieve. And so early retirement is not a good strategy if it comes at the cost of replacing the losses that early retirees will incur on their early retirement pensions. So a quick summary, or not summary, but just conclusions. So the graph on the left, that's the average salaries in the public service in blue compared to per capita GDP. And this is the fundamental reality of what's happened in South Africa, is that public sector salaries have grown much faster than the economy has. And at some point that becomes unsustainable and requires adjustment of some kind. So either you have to stop the growth in remuneration, or you have to reduce headcounts. And effectively what happens is that over the last few years, government, treasury, but cabinet essentially has capped the amount of growth on compensation budgets at very, very low numbers, and forced through a position where remuneration increases have fallen very substantially. The reason they have fallen very substantially is because if you cap the growth of compensation spending as a whole, but you don't cap remuneration increases, then the only balancing item that you've got is the number of people that you employ. And if we assume that compensation budgets are capped to grow at zero in real terms, but you allow remuneration to rise at 3% a year, as it was doing historically, then you have to reduce headcounts by 26,000 people every year. And that's obviously not a sustainable position to be in. So government has been in a process of capping compensation spending growth and trying to make trying to make the slowdown in the growth of remuneration the vehicle for achieving that goal rather than a reduction in headcounts. Obviously, this presents dilemmas. It's not easy to slow the growth in remuneration, nor is it easy to reduce headcounts. The power of slowing remuneration growth was demonstrated in 2020. It made a big difference to the trajectory of public spending, and in particular compensation spending, by implementing basically a nominal wage freeze on the public service in 2020. You can see it in all the data that's the year in which a very substantial kink is visible in the curve of upward spending on compensation, and the consequence is visible in right across the government spending. It's obviously because there's very few resources in the budget as a whole. This didn't translate into more spending in other areas, but it did reduce the pressure on spending elsewhere in government. So this is a very potent mechanism for controlling spending. But if you don't use it, you are. But it's a lever that's totally in the control of the central government, in particular DPSA and National Treasury, but in negotiation with organised labour. Basically, historically and into the future, heads of departments are price takers. They have to implement what the central government and the negotiation generate as the outcome of remuneration agreements. So when you agree that compensation will rise by 3%, then heads of departments have to adjust their plans based on that, because they've got no control over that. So heads of departments can control headcounts, but they can't control remuneration. The flip side is also true. Although central government can control remuneration, actually it's heads of departments, and I think somebody said this in the chat, it's heads of departments that determine how many people are employed by government. And so there's this kind of asymmetry in the tools that remuneration is set centrally. Heads of departments determine who's employed. And the reality is that the heads of departments are, at the very best, reluctant implementers of a strategy that requires reductions in headcounts. So if the agreement on remuneration is something that is not affordable to heads of departments, they are very loath to see headcount numbers fall. Partly it's an incentives issue, as somebody said. There's a kind of sense in which each head of department wants to free ride on the savings made by other heads of department and doesn't want to be the person who cuts their own staff. But a lot of this has to do with the fact that heads of departments are responsible for delivering services, and they know that their services are labor intensive and that reducing headcounts makes it hard to deliver services. So they are, at best, reluctant implementers of a strategy that requires headcount to be reduced. They are also aren't given very many tools for reducing headcount. The one exception is natural attrition. So heads of departments can freeze posts or reduce the replacement rate. So instead of replacing everybody who leaves, you replace half the people who leave, or whatever the ratio is. That they can do. But all the other kinds of tools that a head of department might have, from particular things like retrenchment, those are off the table. They don't really have access to those kinds of tools. And if they did, it would cause them all kinds of problems, right? So they would face a lot of resistance, both from their own staff, but also from the wider provincial government. There's very little appetite for targeted headcount reductions in government. So you have this very uneasy and difficult problem where national departments set wages, provincial heads of departments or heads of departments across government determine how many people are employed, and and it's very hard to coordinate those two decisions. The wage setting departments don't bear all the costs of higher wages, and the employment, and then the effect of that on heads of departments is effectively like an unfunded mandate. They're required to raise wages, but they aren't provided necessarily with the adequate resources to pay for it. And so you have this asymmetry that has made coordination incredibly difficult in government. It's been very hard to have a coordinated strategy of addressing headcounts and remuneration at the same time, because the responsibility lies in two different places. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and allow other people to ask questions or comments or whatever else they might want to say.
Thank you, Antony. Thank you very much. I think you've given us a lot to think about. And I suppose if we're looking for a quick fix in this area, we're not going to get it.
Nope.
It's a really difficult balance to find between the different options which you've outlined, and none of them are easy.
Yeah.
All of them have got implications, and it feels like we can make sort of small movements, and we're not going to find the answer. This is the classic terrain of complexity, where we have to navigate the path.
Yes.
But of course, it's made that much clearer when the data is clearer and when you've got the kind of analysis at our fingertips that you and your team have been doing. So thank you so much. Antony, we've got one question in the chat from Aaron Tsewu, who's, I think, well, if you can answer this, you can get you'll win the prize. But how to strike the balance between a bloated wage bill versus employment, and further, what strategy needs to be implemented to improve service delivery without increasing compensation of employees in the public sector. I will say, Antony, before, just while you start to kind of process that and chew on that, it's the kind of question we were asking before lunch with our panel is, what do we do? What are some of the challenges in implementation? So if you can answer this question, you might become the president.
And there's just one comment before we allow Antony to go.
Please.
From Melanie Kasonk. And it is just a comment. She's saying that the course of action to reduce headcount and payroll costs is inevitably highly conflictual, bureaucratic, and time-consuming, explosive trajectory versus political and social choice. There's always trade-offs.
Yeah. So, Antony, that's a very nice pair of questions for you just to answer quickly and clearly, and then we can move on to the next phase of the democracy.
I mean, I don't have great answers because I think that they are real dilemmas. I think that there's various things we're trying to balance, right? We're trying to be fair to public servants. We're trying to make sure that government is reasonably affordable because because an unsustainable public sector is something that can lead a country into serious crisis. And because we've got a limited tax base and taxes are not insignificant already. And we've got a lot of services that we need to deliver. And there's a sense in which this is a kind of contest over, salaries, service delivery, taxes. And there's really, really no easy answers to it. The one thing that I think, there are a couple of things that I would say in all of this. I think that it is almost certainly true and hard to contest that in the period in which remuneration was rising at 3 or 4% a year in real terms for a long period, productivity in the public sector wasn't rising at the same rate. So the effect of that is that the public sector is becoming more expensive and not delivering services at the higher rates that would justify that spending. So that's part of the disjuncture that, in a sense, needs to be corrected. It's part of the adjustments that has to happen. Having said, but also, we've never delivered all the services we're supposed to deliver or that we promised to deliver. A separate point, and in a sense, a point that is that runs against what I've just said, is that we also know that in public services and in services generally, morale is really important for making organizations work well. That a workforce that is pissed off and anxious about its income and feeling like it's getting the short end of the stick is not a workforce that delivers its best possible its best possible work. So I don't think we've got the balance right. There's a lot of trade-offs that have to manage, and I think that have to be managed. And I think that ultimately a lot of that work has to be done by managers who are trying their best to balance, to make those trade-offs. Because could you guys mute yourselves? And I don't think we've got that right. But I also think that the flip side of that is that there is a lot of room for improvement. And it's finding that room for improvement that I think should be the thing that exercises public servants' imagination. Because I think we're at quite a low equilibrium. One of the things about an equilibrium is you always ask, why is that the equilibrium? But we're at a quite low equilibrium. I think we could do better, and we've got to find the mechanisms for getting onto a better trajectory.
Thanks, Antony. It wasn't the answer we were hoping for, but it's certainly. No, I think Antony, absolutely. This is a balancing act, and there's a few hard facts which we can't shy away from, and I mean they're so well illustrated in those graphs, where the one line is going steeper than the other line. I mean, this is the way I understand things, and when you see that, there's a problem, and we're sitting right in the middle of that problem now. And so our principals are trying to navigate a very tricky terrain. And I know most of our audience are people who, as we go into the public wage negotiations are in play, and people are frustrated. Morale is perhaps low. So what do? This is like really difficult dilemmas. So I think we can empathize with the principals who are having to navigate this path because of the evidence that you have presented to us. And it's true that in real terms, the salaries were increasing, and now they can't keep up with that. And the expectations there. And we've just come out of 2 very hard years with COVID and now the economy. So everybody needs more money.
Tough.
And it is a really tough time.
Yeah.
So, Antony, thank you so much for taking us through the analysis that you and your team have done. It gives us so much food for thought. And in fact, there's another question from Liam in the chat, which we won't entertain now, which is around the age distribution of educators, which perhaps Liam and Antony, you can link up with each other maybe in the lounge and talk about that, and maybe others want to join you for that discussion. But this brings our session with Antony Altbeker on the impact of personnel analysis on public policy to a close. So can we do the emojis for Antony and thank him so much for his input? Ah, goody. It's raining upwards.
It is raining upwards.
Thank you so much, Antony. We're going to stay in this session as we bring today to a close. But Mbali, let me ask you, where are you and where are we?
Jeremy, what a day. There was so much to take in, so much to digest. It's just been a whirlwind of a day. We've had our panel discussions with the HODs and Nogale from the National Treasury. We've had policy debates, we've had presentations. And really for me, it's really encouraging to see that the heads of departments are hands-on and they want to be catalysts for change. And there are officials as well that are making sure that the spending review work and the recommendations that emanate from these reviews are actually being actioned. But perhaps, Jeremy, before I go on a roll, as someone that has been facilitating fully today, can you just give us a summary of the day?
I can. But you've kind of stole my thunder, Mbali, because in some ways you gave us the summary. I think it's been a great day. we started off with you, actually. Well, the two of us. And then you put on your formal hat as the acting head of PEPA and spoke a little bit about the context of now and what our intention is around acting on what we now know. We need to move into the space of action. And that's been a theme that's been pulling through the whole day. Renette, in her role as the acting head of GTAC, reinforced these and reminded us of a vehicle fit for purpose. What we needing to be doing in this current context as we try and do more with a lot less than we thought we'd ever have, and we're acting now and no longer just talking. We had a great panel discussion with the Eastern Cape, Western Cape, and Limpopo heads of department, and Ochale from IGR in Treasury. And we also had a very interesting input from Nsiki Buzani from Eastern Cape Provincial Treasury on the whole issue of learner transport. And what was wonderful was to see us moving from findings into conclusions and recommendations, into actions, into implementation, and keeping an eye on that to see that actually this is resulting in the kind of work that we hoped it would. And then we've ended now with on a rather sober note.
Quite sober.
We are in a very tight spot on remuneration here. How much are we spending on personnel, and how do we analyze that using the tools and techniques that we have been exploring? So that brings us to the end of the day. And I know that our team is going to post a survey in the reception area. There's a survey for you to complete, which has just got 3 questions. They're helpful for us. It'll take you a couple of minutes if you haven't done it already. It just gives a sense of where you're at the end of today.
Yes.
Oh yes, of course, and of course the polls. There are correct answers to the polls. So thank you to those who completed it. If you answered point A, the first option on both of them, you can buy yourself a chocolate. If you did not answer point A, you can't buy yourself a chocolate. So the correct answers were the first one on, and I've written them down somewhere. I don't know where I did.
Let me help you, Jeremy.
Yes.
The first question was, what are the 2 largest departments?
It's health and education.
Yes.
That's point A. And it's on the screen in purple. Oh, look at that. Hey. Okay. So, well, a lot of you were correct. That's brilliant. And then on the second question, which is of the consolidated expenditure in provinces in 2020, what was the proportion of compensation? The correct answer there is 60%. So well done, Jeremy. That was
so
my
are these
answer.
people not getting chocolates?
No, those of us who answered correctly get chocolates, but we pay for them out of our own budgets, and we also buy chocolate for those who didn't get it right to say, keep on trying.
Yes.
Okay, Mbali, I know that people are tired at the end of today, so can you just tell us what we're going to do tomorrow, and then we'll bring it to a close?
Of course. Well, tomorrow we're keeping the momentum going, Jeremy. We're starting a little bit earlier. Tomorrow we're starting at 9 o'clock on the dot, and we hit the ground running with a debate that is for and against outsourcing of security services in the public sector. That will be by various Treasury officials. And really, this is quite a hot topic, and you really, really want to catch this one nice and early. We will continue with the day with presentations again on acting on what we now know. And that's going to be presented by the Justice Cluster in the National Treasury, as well as Security Services in the Eastern Cape. That's going to be by Antony. We end off on a high note, Jeremy, and it's another panel discussion around how can we go about modernizing public finance and the reforms that are required in order to action this, which is really centered around the theme of the conference, around acting on what we now know. We have a wonderful panel there, of course. We have the acting head of GTAC, Renette Engler. We also have the DDG of Public Finance, Mampo Modise, that will be here tomorrow. Andrew Donaldson, who also used to be both the head of Public Finance in the National Treasury, as well as the head of GTAC. We also have Prof. Tanya Ajam from Stellenbosch University. We have Richard Allen. And last but not least, we have Dr. Philip Krauser. We have lots to look forward to, Jeremy, tomorrow.
Great. I thought you were going to say last and not least, you have us.
Oh, that's a given.
You've got us again tomorrow. So we'll see you tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock
bright
If
and
you want to
early.
come a bit early, I think we'll have the platform open from about 1:45, and you can enjoy engaging with each other in the lounge, at the booths, and in the fluid space. So please do so if you want to now as well. Stay on and see who's there, see who you can have a chat with, who you don't normally speak to. We want people to engage on these interesting topics so that we take our creativity to another level in this time of complexity. So today is finished.
It's finished.
Thank you all very much for your attention. Thanks for enjoying this AirMeet platform. And if you've got any technical questions or challenges, pop them in the chat and the team will respond to them. Otherwise, we will see you tomorrow morning. So
Bye.
thanks all. Take care, everyone.
Bye.